What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Dominique and you can call me Dom. Welcome to Faith Family Homestead. Today I'm going to be talking to you about 6 things that were considered fails on my garden for the past year, 2023 garden season. When I mean fails, I mean things that just didn't go right in my garden or things that I thought should have went better. And to start us off with number 1, and it's the biggest thing, if you've been following my journey, then you know why I'm going to pick this one. It is not soil testing soon enough. I soil sampled about 2 weeks ago and just got my results in, which made a lot of sense once I researched and figured out why I had a high or excess amount of phosphorus and potassium, and they don't test for nitrogen, so I don't know what my nitrogen levels are, but excess amounts of potassium and phosphorus can make your plants inefficient or not able to access micronutrients like zinc, calcium, magnesium and iron, and those can show in ways of like yellowing and purpling of the leaves and stuff like that, which I did have. Like right now I'll show you my garlic. I have garlic here that I did not plant. This was overwintered and came back, but if you can see that they have the yellowing streaks, and then sometimes they even have the purple. When I looked this up, this is a magnesium deficiency. When you look up magnesium deficiency on plants, it tells you it has that striping, but then also underneath it can have like the purpling. This can cause stunted growth in your crops. It can cause even death, and it can cause, obviously you see the yellowing. And so I do not have a balanced NPK ratio inside of my garden, and so I'm going to be working the next year to correct that by not adding any phosphorus or potassium, which I've looked up, and it can actually live in your soil. One of them can live up in your soil up to 2 to 3 years, and one can live in your soil up to 12 months. And so that, is from just adding in straight compost, or even with me amending my soil, I would add in blood meal, which is a nitrogen source, as well as bone meal, depending on if I was planting a root vegetable like this garlic or onions or anything like that, because it produces healthy roots. But since I already had a good amount of it in my soil, because I did not know that South Carolina soils close to the coast are already high in phosphorus and potassium. So not knowing my soil type was definitely a fail on my part. I've never soil tested before. I've never soil tested my previous garden, and I just always assumed that it would be super hard to soil test. I was even kind of nervous doing the soil test before I sent it over, because I just never done it before. But it turned out to be super easy, and it is so beneficial. In my previous garden, I didn't soil test, and I had great soil results, but I also used such a wide variety of mixture of soils because I was on a limited budget. And so I didn't use anything in bulk. So I used some compost that I used here in my garden that's from the landfill, but not nearly as much because it was an hour away from me to get it. And since I didn't have a truck, I had to get it by the 5-gallon bucketfuls. I didn't have a lot of 5-gallon buckets, and so I bought a lot of bag soil that was ripped on clearance in like Lowe's and Walmart and Home Depot. So that was like topsoil, that was garden soil, that was raised bed mixes, potting mixes. I use chicken manure, black cow, mushroom compost, just like anything I can find. And so it didn't have a chance to create those high potassium and phosphorus amounts, because when I came here, we did have a pickup truck. We could get, loads of compost. And so instead of me searching and, I was thinking like this was a more budget friendly alternative, is just to buy the one compost in bulk, have it delivered here so I can use it, as well as topsoil, which turned out it wasn't the best. It was best for buying bag soil. Say I pay $40 for one yard of compost, whereas for $40, if I was to buy bag soil, you're paying for, the bag, you're paying even if it was like ripped and on clearance. And so it was more economical for me to buy just compost, but then that also limited me to the amount of nutrients and varieties that I was bringing into my garden. So I only used the bulk compost, topsoil, peat moss, and when I first built these beds 2 years ago, so it was bulk compost, peat moss, topsoil, azomite, blood meal, bone meal, and that was it, nothing else. Another thing that I did differently in my old garden than I did here is I was composting in place a lot at my old garden. So any food scraps and stuff like that, I would just bury them in the soil, and I had lots of worms and the soil was really healthy. And so even though I didn't soil test, I got a lot of produce from a small amount of area. Where here, I do not compost in place because any food scraps that we have, we either give them to our pigs or our chickens. Mostly our pigs because they're so big and they eat way more than chickens. And so no burying food scraps here. So now that you know why that was a fail, then obviously things I'm going to be doing to better my soil this year is I'm going to be taking another soil test in spring before I plant. I've been reading and looking up how to lower my phosphorus and my potassium levels. And so it's like things like planting legumes. You would think that since you have like high potassium and phosphorus, and that's like roots and stuff, that you would want to plant root vegetables, which is what I thought too. But they actually say the best bet is to plant things like legumes, because legumes fixes nitrogen into the soil naturally, and it takes up that phosphorus and potassium out of the soil through the roots. And so I've been looking into ways that just regenerative gardeners. I watched a video earlier where she plants legumes inside her garden in the spring, and then right before they flower, she cuts them all off, waits about 2 weeks, and then plants into that soil, because that gives, she said, before it flowers and produces fruit, when it flowers and produces fruit, all of the nitrogen goes into the fruit, or the pea or bean or whatever it is. But if you cut it before it flowers, that nitrogen stays inside the soil, and that's why it's called a nitrogen fixer. It was very interesting stuff. I don't know, I'm probably missing some information, but that is what I'm going to probably be doing. I've been looking into ways to get bulk legume seeds, probably peas, and so yeah, I am working on my soil. I'm gonna do another soil test, adding in, I've already bought bulk blood meal. I returned all of my fertilizers that had I returned all my fertilizers that had a NPK of like equal all-purpose fertilizer, and I'm just going to be using blood meal. That is the suggestion that I got from Clemson University, where I sent my soil sample, and that is what they told me. So that is what I'm going to be doing. The second thing that was a complete fail and like really not planned well on my part is I actually, in the middle, I didn't get to plant the whole garden, which left a lot of beds unattended. And when you leave beds unattended, then you're going to have a high weed pressure. And that is exactly what happened to me. I ended up going on a missionary trip unexpectedly. I had only planned to send my son on the missionary trip, but he is still a minor and it was out of the country. And so I, said, oh yeah, I can go with him when I was asked, and not really thinking about the long-term effects on that with the garden. I had asked my daughter and my husband to watch the garden and to water my hoop house, because that is where I had all my tomatoes and, well, a lot of my tomatoes, but all of my sweet peppers planted. And they ended up getting sick. I was gone for more than a week. They were sick the whole time I was gone. And then we even had like a really bad storm. It knocked down my Greenstalks and they haven't recovered since. Weeds got way out of control. A lot of plants died because the lack of water. I do not have irrigation out here. So that's another thing that I'm looking into this this fall. Right now we're still in fall, but this fall, winter is looking into getting some irrigation, especially in my log raised beds, because they're at the complete back of my garden. And so it's the hardest to get the hose back there past all of these plants. This is a 90-foot, my garden is 90 feet each way, and then wide it's about 40 feet. So since that's the second thing, which is like not planning when I'm going to be gone and what I can do in case, you know, of an emergency, or that, you know, my garden can't be watered or anything like that. And I've already touched on weeding, which would be the third thing. But in conjunction with unexpected, you know, trips, I am trying to better plan any, like, going forward, anything that I am going to be leaving the homestead for a certain amount of time, to better try and have a watering schedule and a planting schedule, and just making sure that I stay on top of and giving myself room for even coming back to reality, because that was an adjustment as well, is coming back to reality and needing that downtime to recuperate, and from jet lag and travel mindset and all that stuff. So looking at my calendar, making sure there's nothing, trying to not do as many things that I would have to leave the homestead for. So really just took my schedule back a lot. The third thing, which would be weeds, is I bought landscape fabric, the same landscape fabric that I've used in my pathways, which have worked well. And a lot of my beds, as many beds as I can, I am going to be laying landscape fabric down on the top of beds. So my son converted these beds. They were 3x6s, and I didn't really like that design once I've been gardening in it for 2 years. And so we made them into 15 feet beds. All the beds that we made them into 15 feet beds. And I'm going to be laying, they're still 3 feet wide, so I bought 3 feet landscape fabric. And like I said, any beds that I have the opportunity, I'm going to be laying down landscape fabric to balance weeds. I do want to come up with a better system of managing weeds, like maybe like a weekly weeding schedule of like sections of the garden, like maybe one day I want to completely cover the log raised beds with landscape fabric, but some of the beds out here where I can't really cover completely with landscape fabric, just having a system in place where I can weed more often and just have a better regimen going. But that also works with scheduling and stuff like that. And so I'm looking ahead and planning, which usually I am a fly by the wings of my pants girl, and I realized that doesn't work in such a large garden space and what I have going on and the goals that I have. Another thing that I already briefly touched on, which would be my fourth point, is again time commitments. Like I said, I briefly touched on it, but as well as going on a missionary trip, there's other things that happened that kind of just diminished my time in the garden. Once I got back from the missionary trip, I was recovering, and so that took like about a week of recovering and me not inside the garden. But then I also started a youth girls Bible study that was weekly, and so we started doing that. My husband also has an evangelism team, and we go out every Saturday. And so I was going out on Saturdays. I was going out to the girls' Bible study. I am a biblical counselor at my church, and so then I was there one of the days. So that's already 3 days that I was doing something, leaving the homestead, and we do live in the country, so everything is, at least 45 minutes to an hour away from our house. And so, when you add in the time that you're there, plus, an hour both ways, give or take, that's like 5 hours away at minimum away from the homestead, depending on what we're doing. And that especially if we're gonna have fellowship and hang out afterwards or whatever. All of that played a part, and that was right in the beginning of June. I also started a women's monthly brunch meeting, and that all just happened at one time. I was already counseling, and we were already doing evangelism, but adding in the Bible studies and the trip and then the brunch, that kind of all happened in conjunction at once with the trip, and it just became overwhelming, and something had to take a backseat, and unfortunately that was my garden. And since I didn't get to plant all of the beds that I didn't plant just grew weeds, and that was just not okay. And then it made me, I have analysis paralysis, and I've shared that in a video. And I suffer with ADHD, and so when something just feels overwhelming, I just don't want to do anything. If I feel like I can't do it all and finish it, I don't want to do anything. So like, it, you know, coming out here and just like, oh, let me do one bed. It's like, no, if I can't do the whole garden, I don't want to do it. And so that's kind of, that kind of mindset just pushed me away from the garden. And now I've come to realize that I can't do that. Like, you know, so now I've been better at using a little bit time here and there and stuff like that. The fifth thing is pests. I came to the front because this is a pecan tree right here. And these trees at the beginning of the growing season, we had a outbreak of those caterpillar, I think they were called tent caterpillars. And I shared about that. That's the whole reason why I didn't get my whole garden planted, because I was like those, I am very, very like panicky, afraid of creepy crawlies, bugs, anything like that. And they were covering, people were sending me, it was so bad that people were sending me videos of saying how there was like an epidemic in the Edisto River, and so they were like just coming out and literally just covering, that whole tree was covered with tent caterpillars. It was disgusting. They would just, they were falling from the sky. Literally, we would come out here and they would just be dropping on your head, dropping on your shoulders. And so I avoided coming outside. It was disgusting. I was in panic mode, and that affected me getting my garden planted. And so yeah, pests played a huge role in, and I'm calling it a garden fail because that last year was the and I did try to spray them with like BT and stuff. So last year was the calipers, the year before that was the Japanese beetles. So who knows what it's going to be this year in the garden. Hopefully not, you know, not caterpillars, because those were just, that was just bad. Like dropping from the sky. Japanese beetles, they don't drop from the sky, but, and grubs, that's what it was the first year. It was grubs, Japanese beetles, and even we had a lot of those tomato, what are those caterpillars called, that eat, or tomato plants. We had a lot of those, but last year it was like we didn't even have a lot of those tomato eating caterpillars. It was those tent caterpillars. And yeah, and then now even in the hoop house, a lot of what I'm seeing is aphids. So maybe it's going to be aphids this year. I don't know. I can't really plan on you know, predicting which pests we're going to deal with, but being proactive and actually spraying, or if it's just one plant, you know, just letting that be like a trap crop. I shared about if you plant what is it called, amaranth next to squashes, how it's a trap crop for squashes, cucumbers, and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the main trap crop that I know that actually works. I know there's other trap crops, but the one that I've used and know for fact works is amaranth planted with your cucumbers and squashes. And last but not least, the sixth thing that was like really struggled with, and that was a fail here in the garden area, was this fencing during the summer. So we have a side that we consider like the animal side, or like the goat side, but that side is like really low. And when we first moved here, this whole thing was forest, was very overgrown, and we had it forest mulched. And so we have lots and lots of wood chips. And on the animal side, or the side that we consider the animal side, was really low, a low point on our homestead. And so that had the thickest amount, probably over a foot of wood chips, which took way longer to break down than I even thought. I thought it was going to take one season, but since there was so much, like a thick layer of wood chips, it took way longer to break down. And so we're on our second year since living here, and there's still some places that are like a thick layer of wood chips, which means that grass didn't grow there. And so on this side, which was much higher, grass grows really rapidly. And so we were letting our goats come over here and eat like the grass, and like there's little like tree sprigs sprouting up. And with that, they would always somehow make their way over to the garden. And even though the garden is protected by this fencing, and I chose this fencing because they said it was for goat and sheep, they called it goat and sheep field fencing. which I'm thinking that it's going to protect away. You know, I'm not a farmer, like, you know, wasn't raised with these terms and stuff. I'm thinking that it's going to keep goats, you know, contained. No. First of all, baby goats can fit through there. They can squeeze their body and fit through there. And then second of all, even adult goats can squish their head in through there. And so they would squish their head in there. They ate my roses. So my roses they're right here. They should be so much higher. This is the second year they've been there. They should be so much higher. But they ate my roses down probably about 3 times. Then they would squish their head in here. And I had planted tomatoes there because I read that they wouldn't eat tomatoes. And for a while they left the tomatoes alone, but then after, I guess, they decided to eat everything fun, they even ate the tomatoes, or they would even squish their head in around the tomatoes and eat what I had planted in front of the tomatoes. So it was just a hot mess. We realized we couldn't let them back out on this side, and so we would just have to mow this side and keep them contained on, there was an ant on me biting me, and keep them contained on the animal side. So yeah, goats and our fencing, and not knowing that, like, the fencing is 4 by 4 by 4. That's 4 inches. You would think that, you know, it could protect, but it didn't. And it's crazy. I was definitely thinking like, oh, I would have problems with deer because we see deer in our neighbor's yard. He has a 4-foot fence and they just jump his fence, and we have a 4-foot fence. And so I wasn't expecting that it was going to, you know, not let the deer jump in here. I was hoping that they wouldn't jump in here, and they don't because of our dogs. But, you know, it's really my own animals that are the most destructive in my garden. So with all of these things and looking back over the garden, I am working on changing things. One of the major things that I've changed, you know, like I said, is the soil testing, but I've also changed the layout of the garden. I'm looking into getting the soil, the drench, what is it called, drip tape or whatever, into the garden so that can fix the watering. I was planting, one of the big things that I dealt with is when I built this garden, I did not build it with the mindset of like what I was going to plant where. And by what I mean by that is I knew that I wanted to grow a lot of tomatoes, but I wasn't thinking I was going to grow them in here. My log raised beds are really, really long, and I was thinking that those were going to be either for predominantly flowers or for perennial things that come back, and I wouldn't have to do anything over there. But what really happened is they turned into the spots where I grew my tomatoes, because what I was thinking originally is that I was going to have a different area, maybe either along the fence or somewhere out of the garden, to grow long rows of tomatoes with cattle panels, and that just didn't work out, which means I couldn't really grow my tomatoes in these 3x6 beds because cattle panels are 16 feet. I didn't want to cut down a cattle panel in case I wanted to redesign my garden, or, you know, use it for an animal project or use it for a hoop coop or whatever. I didn't want to cut it down into, you know, 6-foot cattle panels, which left me planting tomatoes each year in my log raised beds because they could fit a 16-foot cattle panel, because most of them are like 17 to 16, 17, 20, 16 feet, just somewhere in there that could hold a cattle panel, which means that if I'm planting my tomatoes over there, I had to drag the holes all the way across, you know, to the back of the garden. And I was always ending up knocking down a plant because I have that cross raised beds, and really it's, you know, quicker to go across the bed. Sometimes I would turn around and I was, you know, squishing a plant that I didn't mean to squish. It was just really, and then if I didn't want it was just really bad moving that hose. It's heavy when it's hot outside. I'm not a morning person. I've shared that before, and it's really hard for me to get out here, you know, before it's like super, super hot in the day. I have been practicing waking up earlier, with it being winter, and so hoping that it can continue when the summer gets here to retrain my body to be a morning person. But I'm not naturally just a morning happy person. to want to wake up and the first thing I do is come out to the garden and like start watering or weeding or working in here, which you have to do. Living in South Carolina, I live in South Carolina. It's super hot out here during the summer. I know a lot of you guys live in like Georgia and South Carolina and just Texas, hot places as well, Florida. And so you understand, but that's stuff I dealt with. So now taking into consideration all the things I know and just looking back and finding ways to prevent that going forward, which was me redesigning these beds. And so now I can be able to plant my tomatoes closer to me and closer to a water source. So that way, even if I get drip irrigation, I can use it for my log raised beds. My log raised beds are going to turn into just flowers, and hopefully I can get drip on them. And then using my newly 15 feet beds as, you know, putting a cattle panel and having tomatoes. So I've already been like redesigning my garden layout. I'm happy that I changed them into 16 feet. When I had my previous garden, the reason why I did them into the 3x6 is one, I was using what I had, and I had a lot of clearance wood. If you've been here from the beginning, I got this wood for like 40 cents a piece because they're clearance dog ear picket fence, and a lot of them were like bent or misshapen or had a crack. And in my old garden, that was okay because it was just a small side front yard, and I only had probably 15 beds, and they were 3x6s or 4x8s. Here, I have way more space, way more garden space, and so I had way more beds. And over there, I didn't grow a lot of tomatoes. If I did, I used like the small tomato cages or like a stake, where here, I wanted to grow a lot of tomatoes because I want to plant or make pasta sauce and use tomatoes to make, you know, barbecue sauce or ketchup or anything like that. So I'm planting way more tomatoes, and I didn't think about that when I was designing my garden layout. I was just thinking like I wanted to garden that first year. I started building it we moved here October, started building my garden or planted my first thing in the garden in December. And then that first season of garden is when once I had everything planted, is when I realized, oh, I'm not gonna be able to plant tomatoes where I thought, and had to readjust. And then going into the second year, I just thought, oh, I'll just, you know, keep it the way it is. But now I realize that I want to change it, and so that's what I'm doing. So I'm hoping, you know, learning from my mistakes going forward into the next season, you know, keeping an eye on my soil test and being knowledgeable and learning as I go, and you know, planning when I'm going to be gone, getting that drip irrigation, doing all those things, learning about soil health and stuff like that is going to help me going forward, and hopefully it can help you too. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing me ramble and enjoyed this information, and just like hearing all the things I struggled with here in my garden and how I'm going to improve it going forward. And thank you guys for being here. I appreciate all of you guys, and I'll have to see you guys in my next video. Bye.